I started Bradshaw LeRoux Consulting now 27 years ago. I was an industrial psychologist. We were moving into a more democratic economy in South Africa at the time. And there was a real awareness that people had different and diverse opportunities to access education and employment. And so I was one of the young and enthusiastic industrial psychologists. I was a pioneer of doing competency-based assessments at the time. But the whole idea was to say, how do we recognize the potential and the abilities of people with diverse histories who've had diverse and inequitable opportunities to education and to employment? And how do we nurture, enrich, grow, and build that talent pipeline so that it feeds the needs of business, both now and in the future? I also happen to be a wheelchair user. So while I was out there delivering my assessment services, people were also saying, oh, we've noticed that you're disabled. You know, we have to hire disabled people for our employment equity targets. Do you know of anybody? And I would say, well, no, we don't really hang around in flocks, but what are you looking for? What I found so interesting was that there was a very clear knowledge about disability from a medical perspective. So that whole diagnosis, prognosis, and assumption. And that is very prevalent in a lot of the organizations, particularly mining, manufacturing, and so on, and production-based businesses. The moment someone declares they've got a disability, they get sent to the doctor. The doctor then goes, well, that's the diagnosis, that's the prognosis, there's the policy, and we will decide on their abilities and suitabilities based on that. Okay, we get that model of disability inclusion. The problem is that it doesn't speak to anything about the individual abilities of people. So the reason why I bring this up is the medical understanding of disability is the problem that is disabling someone lies with them individually. Okay, it doesn't recognize that most of the disabling barriers come from our environments, our attitudes, and the world that we live in. It says we must fix people with disabilities, so we must treat them, rather than saying, well, let's look at the disabling barriers and remove them. And it also does, based on a diagnosis and a prognosis, we will decide what type of disabilities we can include in our business. Now, the problem with that is we focus on the disability and not on the person's abilities. By way of example, I will tell you that if I was to send my CV to your company and say, I would like to apply for a job in your company, and you look at the CV and the first thing you come across is, oh, she's got a disability. That's quite interesting. What is it? Spinal muscular atrophy type 2. So you go and say, I don't know what that is. So you Google it. Spinal muscular atrophy type 2. When you see the prognosis, you would go, oh, I don't think so. We're not equipped to employ this person. Because the prognosis is, firstly, I'm 20 years past my sell-by date. So immediately you would be going, well, you know, she's lucky she's lived this long. There's no point investing in upskilling her because she hasn't got long to go. So return on investment won't be great. Secondly, I'm not supposed to be able to speak or breathe or swallow unassisted by this stage. And so you'd be going, oh, we're not medically, like we're not equipped to deal with that severity of disability. So before you've even had a chance to meet me, to see my abilities, to see what my individual abilities are, and that are not necessarily at all aligned to a typical diagnosis prognosis, I've already been binned in terms of a shortlisting of an applicant. So you can start to understand that when we understand disability from a medical perspective, we often lose opportunities to tap into people's abilities. Now, the social welfare model of disability, which is also where we're comfortable in investing our corporate social investment spends, in special needs schools and all of that, because we recognize that people with disabilities have been excluded and therefore need welfare to protect their vulnerability. Now, here's the problem. There are some people with disabilities out there that are vulnerable and that do need social welfare protection. There's also people without disabilities that are vulnerable and need social welfare and protection. There are people with disabilities that are not vulnerable, don't need protection, but they just need an equalized opportunity to be educated and employed and earn a good salary like everybody else. Okay, what we've got to be very careful is that when we view people with disabilities as a demographic, that we don't make assumptions about how they suffer and they're vulnerable and they need to be looked after and we need to nurture them. Because you take that perception, you put it in the workplace, and what happens is we go, We're a really busy team. We don't have time to look after somebody with a disability. We don't have time to pick up the things that they can't do. All right, we have this perception. If you look at my situation, what I found so interesting is I get credit for doing, like I'm in a wheelchair, so I've got a visible disability, and I get credit for doing very little. The other day, someone told me I was brave and inspiring because I bought groceries from a shopping center. They said, "Hello, my dear, do you need help?" And I said, "No, I'm fine, thank you." "Are you here all by yourself?" I'm like, "Yes, why?" "You are such an inspiration. You do all your own grocery shopping." I'm like, I don't think grocery shopping is brave and inspiring. The thing is, we've got such low expectations of what we think people with disabilities can do that when we do something quite normalized, we think it's brave and inspiring. Now take that low expectation, put it in the workplace, and you can start to see why people are often concerned or resist employing people with disabilities. So what was my vision when I discovered all of this? What I decided to do was get active in the economy. I want to be able to speak the business imperative. Why disability confidence is good for business. Why including people with disabilities doesn't just benefit people with disabilities, it benefits everybody. And why it's a good return on investment. So how do we rethink disability and put it in a different way that showcases its value? And so at the moment, what I do is I do a lot of talks, awareness campaigns, and I offer a number of different services in our organization that help different stakeholders at different points of entry and at different levels. So last week I was in Rome speaking to the UN about how to make disability confidence standardized in every type of support and development, agriculture, finance, and so on. The day before that, I was speaking to a young person with a disability in South Africa that was trying to access opportunities to work. The day before that, I was speaking to an international employer that goes, "We've got great disability confidence in our European companies, but in Spain and Brazil and Africa, they're terrible. How do we do best practice consistently?" Okay, I like to think that one of the most important competitive advantages I can bring to your conversation is that I'm a business person. I get the needs of business. I'm a person with a disability. I get the needs of equality and inclusion. All right, you put those together, but you start to understand that disability confidence is actually just good leadership and good business. Okay, so that's what we'd like to talk around today. How do we take that understanding and repositioning of disability and take it as a return on investment in terms of upskilling and incapacitating our future talent of people with disabilities as a pipeline to feed directly into our economy and our businesses and our industry? Okay, I want to shake off a few misperceptions about disability. You know, very often, and I heard someone speak the other day, and it was a most amazing way of illustrating. We think disability only affects a few people in the world. And therefore, we don't really see the return on investment. Okay. But disability is the largest minority group in the world. It's over 1.85 billion people on this planet have a disability. Okay. Of those 1.85 billion, only 5% actually use wheelchairs. Now, we're the poster children of access and inclusion, which I'm not complaining about because I get rocking parking spots. But the reality is so many disabilities are not visible. And yet we don't feel confident to tell people we've got non-visible disabilities because we fear the stigma, because we fear the discrimination that may happen. Okay, once we start to realize that 15% of the world's population have a disability, we start to realize the economics of it. Let's work that out. 1.85 billion people on the planet have a disability. 1.27 billion of those are spending money actively in our economy. Okay? And they are making consumer choices based on accessibility and inclusion as a factor. Now, we've also got a network of influence around us. And that network of influence is also going to be influenced by accessibility and inclusion in terms of their spend. So you can add that 2.4 billion plus the 1.27 billion gives you 3.5 billion people on this planet that we have not even considered in our supply chain, not even considered in our talent pipeline, not even considered as consumers. What does that translate to? They reckon that business loses out on $13 trillion of disposable income worldwide because it doesn't consider disability, confidence, and inclusion and accessibility in the way it does business. Now, that is just not smart business. Okay, when we start to realize that customers count, that supply chain relationships that are accessible and inclusive are beneficial to everyone, that the people who work for us that feel safe to declare they've got a disability are such an incredibly rich resource of information on how we can do better. We start to realize that sustainability is inherently linked to our ability to flex, adapt, include everybody. So let's have a look. If we look at sustainability goals, the one thing I wanted to tell you is a very interesting piece of information I heard the other day. They reckon that 44% of young professionals entering Australia's economy are identifying as neurodiverse. Okay? And what that basically means, not all people with neurodiversity have a disability, but what it does reflect is that 44% of youth entering our economy in Australia are saying, we do things differently. You can hold us to the same standards, but so it's not about how we perform, it's about how well we perform. And if as an employer or me as a customer, if you don't adapt to my individual needs and allow me to bring my whole self to work, I don't want to work for you. So our future talent pipeline become more aware and conscious of who they want to work for. Do I want to work for an organization that's going to see me as an individual and allow me to bring my individual value in its full multiverse of being? Okay, is that business reflecting inclusion and responsibility in the way it does business? Because I'm an ethical consumer, I'm an ethical employee. I want to back a brand that is all about sustainability and inclusion because I've got to live in this world for the next 50 years. Okay, if we don't become diversity confident, we are not going to sustain. And disability is a fantastic way to learn how to become individually supporting and diversity confident. If I translate that to how it benefits your business right now, here's a couple of things to think about. At the moment, they reckon that 90% of people with a disability, where they've got an invisible disability, 90% will be reluctant to declare they've got a disability to their employer. That means you've already got people with disabilities working in your organization. That means that they're too nervous or worried about telling you they've got that disability. Now, what if that puts people at a greater risk because they're too scared to tell you? Do you know how many people I've come across who have epilepsy and they don't want to tell their employer because there is a policy that if you have epilepsy, you are a safety risk, you cannot work in that environment, and they've seen people get like fired for incapacity or medically boarded. Right, what disables that person? The policy. You know why? Because people with epilepsy are different. They're unique. They have diverse abilities. They have diverse responses. They've got diverse triggers that may or may not put them at risk of a seizure. So you can have one person with epilepsy where they don't feel the seizures coming. It's exacerbated by a warm, hot, stuffy environment. And so working in a production area, which is very hot, stuffy, and they don't feel like when a seizure is coming on, that is in fact a safety risk. Then you can have somebody else that has epilepsy. They feel the seizures coming on within half an hour. So they've got half an hour to get to a place of safety if the seizure is coming. But their trigger is not a hot, stuffy environment. Their trigger is something different, like flickering lights. There are no flickering lights in this particular area that they're going to be working in. So can you see that what has disabled them is the policy? Because the policy doesn't apply to them. What is the policy there for? Protecting someone's safety. If they are not at any higher risk than anybody else, then that policy doesn't apply to them. So the moment we start to put a one-size-fits-all policy and practice for disability as a demographic, we start to discriminate. For me, if you want safe and empowered team, you want to create psychological safety where people feel confident to declare. How do we get them confident to declare? We behave better. We show that if someone doesn't declare a disability, our conversations, what we're going to do next, our behaviors in response are going to be enabling steps. Because why? Then we can help you remove the barriers that are disabling you. If we remove barriers that disable you, we get a more productive and enabled team. And that speaks to good leadership. What is a leader's job? What is disabling my people? What do I need to do to enable them so they are bringing their full, committed, productive, and motivated selves to work? Because if I do that and I recognize their individuality and I allow them to have equalized opportunity to bring their A game to work, I start to get a much more flexible, committed, and adaptive business. And that makes it more sustainable. So, done a lot of talking around that right now. What is disability? Because one thing I do want to tell you is how we define disability and who are considered to be people with disabilities. That differs depending on where you are in the world, who's defining it, why they're defining it. All right. In South Africa, the labor legislation says it's a person with a long-term or recurring physical, sensory, mental, or communication, I think it is, barrier, impairment, which in interaction with various barriers puts them at a disabling disadvantage. That's kind of what it means. But did you know that the first definition of disability in the American Disabilities Act had homosexuality listed as a disability? The reason why I'm telling you this is I'm showing you what we consider as neurodiverse disability today, or a learning disability today, might not even be a learning disability or a neurodiversity related disability in the future, because society has changed. Okay, so for me, in leadership, it's not so important to go, what is the medical impairment? What type of impairment is it? Is it long-term? The only reason why that definition has any value to you as a business person is because the moment someone is recognized by the labor law as a person with a disability, it kicks in their legal rights to be protected from unfair discrimination. You are obliged by law as an organization to reasonably accommodate. The tricky part is, what is reasonable? Okay, what's more useful is to go, what is disabling our people? And that for me is where this model of inclusion becomes so important. An impairment with a barrier will disable you. An impairment with an enabler will include you. I'm in a wheelchair. My barrier is a step, and that excludes and disables me. I'm in a wheelchair. I have a ramp that includes me. Can you see your job as a leader, as a manager, as a line manager, is to go, what is disabling you in this role, and how can we enable you? And that's disability confidence. It's not such a scary big ask. So how do we know what these barriers are? Well, there tends to be three types of barriers that we look at. And for me, this is really important when we're looking at considering skills programs, learnerships programs, inviting talent with disabilities to apply for opportunities in our business. Be very careful that you don't use your attitudinal barriers to decide people's competence. One of my favorite things, or typical examples of this, is when we decide what job is suitable in our business for people with disabilities. That is exactly the same as saying which job in our company is suitable for Black people. Okay, it's a massive discrimination. Why? Because within the category of disability, you've got such a diverse range of abilities and skills and knowledge and opportunities. And so how could you possibly say what job is suitable for people with disabilities? I'll tell you what job is suitable for just people with disabilities. All your jobs, provided they've got the skills and abilities, you can remove the disabling barrier to the point where they can bring their value to the workplace. How do you know that? You have to ask them, because you don't know. Another typical example of an attitudinal barrier is when we go, well, what types of disabilities can we accommodate in our business? Again, you don't know, because what disables people is completely different. Let's say you have two people who are both 100% deaf, same medical diagnosis, prognosis, neither of them can hear. This person's raised in a community where disability is seen as a curse, or they're unlucky. So the family are embarrassed having this curse, this child with a disability. So they keep them away. They keep them at home. The only school they can go to for special needs children is down the road, and it only goes to grade 7. They don't have speech therapy, occupational therapy. So the only communication they have is like an informal kind of sign language. So this person doesn't speak English, doesn't have another way of communicating, only knows informal sign language, and only has a grade 7. This person was in a family where they felt very strongly that the child should be able to communicate in English. So they went to speech therapy, they went to occupational therapy, and they learned how to speak and lip read in English. They went to a mainstream school where they were able to navigate the barriers of communication and so on. They had a facilitator in the classroom, and that facilitator allowed them to go through and get a matric certificate. They then went into business, into studying, and they got an MBA. Can you see that this person can speak and lip read in English, has an MBA degree, is disability confident in their own abilities? Who's more disabled? What disables people? Culture, labeling, attitudes, money, access to resources, access to enabling circumstances, how disabling the community is that you live in. And that's why you can never, ever match someone's disability to a job. Okay, our environment has huge barriers in it, so we think. But what makes it ironic is we keep making the barriers over and over again. I mean, what I found so frustrating is I've recently had to move to the UK. In South Africa, our public transport system is ridiculously inaccessible. Okay, so it really disables people with mobility impairments or being able to get from A to B. In the UK, every bus has to, by law, be reasonably be wheelchair accessible. So I can get on any bus and go whenever I want to around a town unrestricted. It's the first time in my 51 years of life that I have not had to pre-plan every trip out. So what's important is knowing what barriers disable us in our business and knowing how to organically start to remove them is what's important. You know, it's not a big financial outlay. It's not about making massive changes and making our entire business wheelchair accessible. Remember, only 5% of people with disabilities use wheelchairs. It's about getting people who work for us to feel confident, people who are in learnership programs on site to feel confident to go, these are disabling barriers. These are ways to get around those barriers. Let's have conversations and then let's put a plan in place that over time we can systematically start to remove those disabling barriers. Our organization policies and procedures. These are when we have policies or practices that either make assumptions about people like nobody with epilepsy can work in this environment, or they exclude disability in the way that they are structured. An example of that is in our supply chain. So we go, we'd like to invite people with disability, and we'd like to invite companies to provide a tender to come and provide a service or a product. Let's say it's forklifts, okay? So we put a tender out, we say procurement, come through and put your tenders in. The only thing we check about disability is how many scorecard points that supplier has. That's really the only thing we say about disability. We don't say by policy, well, how do you adapt? You know, how adaptive are your forklift drivers for people with different abilities? What accessibility and inclusion solutions have you built into your products and services that you're offering us? Have you gone about, or how have you gone about making sure your products and services are disability confident? The moment your supplier is able to do that as part of a solution, can you see what a competitive edge that becomes for that supplier? Because it helps you as a business already become more disability confident because you're onboarding services or products that are more accessible for all. But your supplier has now got a competitive edge over another business. And that is smart business. So something as simple as making sure that our procurement processes are disability confident and are accessible is a huge thing. So in a nutshell, how do we do disability confidence? We go, what could disable you in this role and in this environment? What can we adjust or add or remove that would enable you to bring your A game to this environment? What is our responsibility as the employing company to do that? What is your responsibility as the individual to bring your A game to work? And once we've learned this, can we share this with everybody else so everybody else can get on board with the conversation? What it comes down to is recognizing that disability confidence doesn't just benefit. You could have this conversation with anyone. You've got a new applicant coming into the business, you can say, so what could disable you in this environment? I don't know Excel. I see that this is a really highly data-orientated business and we have to do a lot of reports in Excel. My knowledge of Excel is not that great. No problem. We'll enable you by putting you on an Excel course and giving you a bit of show and tell coaching. What is our accountabilities? To find the supplier and put you on the course. What are your accountabilities? To take the learning seriously and put what you've learned in practice. Can you see whether you've got a disability or not? Same conversation. This is not a new skill. This is extending what you know and taking it further. So when it comes to skills programs, this is why Circular Energy and Bradshaw LeRoux are so committed to this. We understand that there is great advantage in investing in skills development for people with disabilities. You get skills rebates, you get BE scorecard, and the compliance people jump up and down with great enthusiasm. But there's a difference between common practice and good practice. And that for me is what I really want to emphasize here, because we have done a terrible job of upskilling and training people with disabilities in this country. And the reason why I tell you that is because if you have a look at our Employment Equity Act, and when was it? 1994. You have a look at the stats that reflected how many people with disabilities worked in our economy. It was less than 2%. Okay? 25 years later, guess what? We're still less than 2%. We've even got worse. If you take learnership programs out of the equation, we've got worse. And I can see that in my recruitment business. 15 years ago, 20 years ago, most of our vacancies that were starting to come about was for people, they were general vacancies for permanent position, permanent placements. And then the government, in their wisdom, included learnership programs. Okay, now the theory of learnership programs are outstanding. It says, we will give you a year, or whatever the time period is, you will do a theory component that will give you a certification. But most important, we know that a certification without work experience is not going to help you get a job. So we'll also build in a work experience component. And that way you have the certification and you have the practical experience, and that makes you more employable. Great idea in theory. To make it better and more attractive, we will help companies by letting you get BEE scorecard points and getting some tax rebates for doing it that way. Companies being awesome. Learnerships are the way forward. But you know what? It's an opportunity for skills providers to go, I'll tell you what, we'll do them for you. So you can outsource your learnership program. We will find the people with disabilities. We will train them offsite. We will teach them in a skill, and you don't even have to worry about it. We've got the solution for you. So you sit there in business going, how clever are we? We're upskilling future talent with a disability, and we're not even inconvenienced in our business by it. But what is it doing? It's disempowering people with disabilities. Okay, why? Because what we do is we go, let's run a learnership for people with disabilities, because that will help us get the most skills rebates and BEE scorecard points. That is segregation. Okay, I know, because as a business, when a client says to me, I want to run a skills program for just people with disabilities, even when you're looking at grant funding, do you know how much grant funding is out there to upskill people with disabilities in targeted programs? Here's the problem. We are segregating people with disabilities. We are not including. One of the biggest gifts I was given as a child was that I snuck through mainstream schooling. Even though I wasn't allowed at the time to go to a mainstream school, you had to go to a special needs school. I went to a mainstream school. The advantage was it gave me the opportunity to learn how to compete and succeed in a mainstream world. I learned how to deal with bullies. I learned how to deal with assumptions. I learned how to solve problems of inclusion. So by the time I got to the workplace, into tertiary education and the workplace, I'd already mapped out half of the solutions that I was going to need to get me through the economy. If we keep people with disabilities in segregated programs, we are not teaching them how to be included. More importantly, we are not changing the way we do business. So the moment you think about doing an offsite learnership where you go to somebody else, you are not feeling the real impact of the barriers to inclusion. And so you're not doing anything to change those barriers. So when somebody wants to apply for a job with your company and they have a disability, your barriers are all still there. The advantage of having learners with practical experience in your work environment is that you get to understand the impact of disabling barriers, and you've got insight from people on how to remove those disabling barriers. That opens up the opportunity for employment. Okay, not just in bringing in people with disabilities, but what about when people acquire a disability that already worked for you? Your ability to retain that talent is enhanced. Okay. We also tend to, when we outsource learnerships, we go, Shame, you know what, it's probably better if they do an business admin learnership, because then they can do it off-site and we can give them simulated work experience. But it's not really related to what we need in business. So we've upskilled thousands of people with disabilities, and they've got business admin certifications. But guess what? We don't need business administrators in our business. There's hundreds of them. What we need is specialized skills. We need coders, business analysts, IT, environmental specialists. So why are we not investing in talent that we need? As a business, what does your future talent pipeline look like? Okay, and so for me, I call it basket weaving. We love to give people with disabilities jobs that we think is okay, they can manage it. So we get them to weave baskets, but guess what? We don't want baskets in our economy. Okay, so we train what's more convenient for us rather than what we actually need as an economy. The consequence, learnership churn is real. Do you know that the word learnership is becoming a swear word amongst talent with a disability? Because what happens is, the way that the structures are set up, it's sometimes more attractive to just bring in waves of learners with a disability, outsource them to somebody else. You don't retain them. You don't keep them. You just keep that wave of churn. Do you know how many people we've got that have been on 5 or 6 or 7 learnerships? None have converted to real employment. Why? We don't have vacancies for those skills. So what happens is, people with disabilities and learnerships, they learn how to work the system. So they go, okay, so I'm getting a 3,500 Rand stipend, but there's a learnership that I've just heard of over there that's going to pay 4,000 Rand a month. So guess what? I'm going to drop out of this one and I'm going to go to that one. Do you know the nonsense that happens where now you've got some learners that are doing 3 learnerships at a time? But because it's outsourced and because we don't really care about whether or not they arrive on site, because we're not really teaching them skills we need. They're not really part of a team. Their lack of attendance or performance doesn't affect us as a business. We don't really mind. So what happens is, I get people with disabilities out there just learning to work the system. Now, the problem is they get to 35 years old. Now you no longer are seen as youth. Now you no longer have value. So do you know how many people with disabilities over 35 are out there, unemployed, unable to work the learnership system, and there's no hope? So we've got to start thinking about, might be more convenient for us, but what is the end goal? Okay, if we want to get people with disabilities as a future talent pipeline that are actually skilled in what we need, if we want to keep people with disabilities on our learnership programs, we've got to start showing how there's a pathway to employment. And that is what the trick is. So all of our learnership programs start off with going like this. What is the in-demand skill that you need in your business right now? What does the job of that entry-level profile look like? So we just ran a program, for example, where it's cybersecurity specialists, okay? So we need people to have a basic foundation of, it's a short skill of, like I think it's a 6-month program, and it gets people upskilled in the basics of networking and cybersecurity. But they needed to have a year experience before they entered the vacancies that are in demand, okay, are difficult to fill. So then we put them on a 1-year learnership where now they've got the international certification and they're now getting 1 full year work experience with that company, learning what they need to do and getting the work experience. Once they finish that, they will feed directly into the vacancy that is in short supply. We cannot find enough talent for these vacancies. It's a big demand in business. That way, people can see a pathway to a long-term career, because that's what people want. We want a career that will make our lives better, that we can be included, that we can earn a salary, that we can grow in. Nobody wants to stay whirling around in this learnership churn of uncertainty. So go, what is the vacancies we need to fill? And then work back your talent pathway, or your skills pathway that will feed into that. Okay, it says, let's look at inclusive skills programs. So if you've got a graduate program, if you've got an internship program, if you've got a learnership program, don't have segregated ones that are only for people with disabilities. Look at inclusive ones, because not only are you giving people with disabilities the opportunity to mainstream and learn those skills, but you're making disability more normalized amongst people without disabilities. So when you start feeding that into the economy, it's not such a big, scary, like taboo or frightening topic. Building disability confidence amongst your line managers, your mentors, your colleagues, that is important, because at the end of the day, building disability confidence in the organization will allow for a much smoother selection, onboarding, and workplace experience. But I do want to tell you, disability confidence training is just as important for people with disabilities. Remember, I was raised in a culture where I was taught to perceive myself as equal. I was taught how to make sure I had an equal opportunity to succeed, and then I was expected to deliver equally. Other people may be raised in a culture where they are taught to be, shame, I'm very special needs. I need to be looked after. I need to be nurtured. Or I'm a curse. I'm a punishment. I have no value. Disability confidence is just as important for people without disabilities as it is for people with disabilities. So any program needs to look to that. How do we build up that disability confidence? Okay. Because at the end of the day, you want people that can bring equal value to your business. You have to make sure there's an equal opportunity to deliver that value. And then you make sure that you hold people accountable for that equalized performance. So how do we build, or how do we support you in a skills development program? Firstly, we'll find out what is it you need. Let's have a look at what skill you are needing. It's an in-demand skill. Let's work back and do a skills program or skills development like line that says, what do they need here, and how do we build that back so that people can fall in to the skills development program? We will then find that talent for you. We will make sure they've got the abilities. We'll explore the disabling barriers with you. We will explore the enabling needs and the reasonable adjustments with you. We'll capacitate the line managers, the colleagues, or the mentors to become more disability confident, so that when we put our candidates in there, or our learners, or our skills graduates, or whatever in your organization, there's a higher level of relax around how to engage. We'll put every one of our programs, puts our people with disabilities through the Potential program. And that is teaching disability confidence, how to navigate disabling barriers, how to come up with solutions, how to know the difference between equal treatment and special treatment. Okay, and then once they're placement and they've gone through the skills program and they land up in that opportunity in your business, the next step is to go, right, how do we support you in that post-placement and make sure, because it's not an exact science. There might be one or two bumps in the road. We're there to support you at every step of the journey. So if I was to say to you, what are the key components of a disability confident learning journey? It starts off by saying, let's invest in talent we actually need. So that's where your skills program needs to be. Let's make sure that we're supported by allies that can help us travel the journey of disability confidence. Because it is not your role to be a disability inclusion specialist. It's your role to be a good leader, and then to say, how can we enable people, and who can we ask when we need that bit of extra support? Recognize that people with disabilities themselves have great value and conversation to bring. So things like employee resource groups are really a great way to get or tap into conversations around how can we build greater disability confidence in our business, and then how do we extend that up and down the supply chain? Okay, this is an excellent return on investment. And if you have a look at our future economy and what it looks like, if you have a look at this opportunity we sit in to do business differently right now and to be adaptable and flexible, and if we include people with disabilities in that conversation, and the rich experiences of equalizing opportunities we can learn from there can be applied to everybody, then that makes it a great return on investment.